The billionaire handed his pregnant wife divorce papers and walked away thinking he'd won. Hours later, she discovered she was carrying twins. His heirs, his legacy, the only leverage that could destroy the empire he'd spent a decade building. And buried in a contract he signed but never read was a clause that would cost him $4 billion and control of his own company the moment he finalized that divorce. Welcome back, my beloved family and friends, to Mr. Crown Stories. If no one has told you today, let me be the one. You are stronger than the storms that tried to break you. You are braver than the betrayals that tried to defeat you. You are the woman who turned her tears into weapons and her pain into power. I create these stories for souls like yours, wounded but not destroyed, carrying scars that have become your crown. If this resonates with your spirit, click subscribe, type "I stand strong," and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because every day, I bring you another story of triumph, and your heart deserves to witness every victory. These words are written for you, the woman who fell but chose to rise more magnificent than before. May your healing be complete, your strength multiply, and your future shine brighter than any darkness you've survived. We walk this journey together, sister to sister, warrior to warrior. Now, let us begin. May the Almighty bless every woman whose heart has been shattered, but whose spirit refused to break. May He wrap her in armor forged from her own resilience, crown her with dignity that betrayal cannot tarnish, and ignite within her a flame so fierce that her pain becomes the furnace where queens are made. She is the silent warrior who transforms love into wisdom and heartbreak into unshakable power. When the world tries to erase her, may she remember, diamonds are born under crushing pressure, and empires rise from ashes. Honor every woman who has been underestimated. Her silence is not surrender, it is the calm before she conquers. Her tears are not weakness, they are the rain that nourishes her rebirth. And when she finally smiles again, that smile will rebuild what betrayal destroyed with foundations no earthquake can touch. If your heart recognizes this truth, like this story, if you believe in women who rise from ruins, write "I stand with Kim." Some women are taught to accept what they're given. Kim Westover was about to teach a billionaire what it costs to take too much. The dizziness started during the champagne toast. Kim had felt it creeping in during the charity gala's silent auction. A subtle tilting of the world she'd attributed to the chandelier's glittering chaos, or perhaps the weight of the emerald necklace Jeffrey had given her last Christmas. The one he'd presented in front of his board members, timing perfectly with a Bloomberg profile about tech's most enviable power couple. She'd smiled through the keynote about women in philanthropy, laughed at the CEO's joke about great women organizing the fundraisers behind great fortunes. She'd worn the deep green silk dress Jeffrey always complimented, the one that made her look regal in society pages even when she felt hollow inside. But halfway through dessert, the ballroom blurred. Pain whispered behind her temples, then grew insistent. A tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the dress's tailored fit. She made her excuses, kissed perfumed cheeks, promised donation checks from accounts bearing Jeffrey's name but her signature, and drove home through streets that streaked like falling stars. The penthouse was dark when she arrived. Jeffrey's text glowed on her phone, * working late. Big presentation tomorrow. Don't wait up. *. He'd left that afternoon for the office, kissed her forehead with distracted affection, the kiss of someone going through motions so practiced they'd become reflex. But before leaving, she'd seen him packing. Not his overnight duffel, but the leather weekend bag with the luggage tag from their Santorini honeymoon, back when his kisses lingered and his eyes actually saw her. Working late, the text said. But the bag was gone. Kim kicked off her Louboutins, sharp, accusing clicks against Italian marble. Her head throbbed. She wanted silence, darkness, and wine she'd drink too fast. Then she saw it. On the kitchen counter, catching the under-cabinet lighting like a white flag, a manila folder. Her heart didn't race. It plummeted. She knew before touching it. Women always know. They feel betrayal the way sailors sense storms, a pressure change, a wind shift, something fundamental screaming danger when the sky looks clear. Expensive paper. Embossed law firm logo. Her name on the tab, Kimberly Westover, dissolution of marriage. Kim stood in her designer kitchen, where she'd hosted investor dinners, played perfect hostess, imagined making breakfast for children in weak, unvoiced moments, and felt the room shrink. Inside, dissolution of marriage. Irreconcilable differences. Asset division. Jeffrey's signature already scrawled, confident as everything he did. A space for hers. Waiting. Empty. Expecting. Page 17 detailed the settlement. Generous, his lawyer probably called it. Monthly allowance astronomical until divided by the 7 years she'd spent building his image, being the polished accessory that made him look trustworthy to investors. Money for her. Empire for him. Scraps from the feast. Her laugh surprised her, soft, broken, something valuable shattering in slow motion. Generous. As though she'd been charity, not wife. The abdominal pain hit like a fist. Sharp. Immediate. Demanding attention like Jeffrey's text messages during dinner, pulling him away, reminding her she was always secondary. Kim doubled over. The folder slipped. Papers scattered like divorce confetti. She couldn't breathe. The Venetian chandelier, $15,000, conversation piece Jeffrey insisted on, became a kaleidoscope of agony. She didn't call Jeffrey. Didn't call anyone. Kim grabbed her keys with shaking hands and drove to Mount Sinai, where Jeffrey's name was on a lobby plaque, where she'd attended ribbon cuttings and smiled for cameras. Emergency room, fluorescent bright, antiseptic cold. Tests. Blood drawn. An ultrasound she didn't understand until. Mrs. Westover. The doctor was young, kind-eyed, pulling her stool close with the careful deliberation of someone delivering life-changing news. We need to talk about your results. Cancer, Kim thought. Cardiac event. Some bodily betrayal matching her marriages. You're pregnant, the doctor said softly, checking her tablet like confirming a miracle. Approximately 9 weeks. And Mrs. Westover. The doctor looked up. You're carrying twins. Monitors beeped. Lights hummed. Somewhere, babies were being born and people were dying and the world spun exactly as always. But Kim's world detonated. Twins. Jeffrey, who said he wasn't ready for children. Who shifted every family conversation. Who insisted timing mattered, business first, legacy later, always later. Jeffrey, who'd filed for divorce without courage to hand her papers himself. Jeffrey, who'd packed a weekend bag and lied about working late. Jeffrey, who had no idea the wife he was discarding carried the only legacy his name would ever truly need. Kim's hand moved to her abdomen. Flat still. Showing nothing. Hiding everything. Mrs. Westover? Should I call your husband? Kim's laugh returned, different now. Not broken. Sharp. A blade being sharpened. No, she whispered, voice steady for the first time since finding those papers. Don't call him. Not yet. Something had shifted. Some fundamental power rebalancing Jeffrey. Brilliant, strategic, always 3 steps ahead Jeffrey, never saw coming. He thought he was divorcing his wife. He had no idea he'd just created his most dangerous adversary. The dizziness started during the champagne toast. Kim had felt it creeping in during the charity gala silent auction, a subtle tilting of the world that she'd attributed to the chandelier's glittering chaos or perhaps the weight of the emerald necklace Jeffrey had given her last Christmas. The one he'd presented in front of his board members, timing the gift to coincide with a Bloomberg profile about tech's most enviable power couple. She'd smiled through the keynote speech about women in philanthropy, nodded at the right moments, laughed when the CEO made a joke about how behind every great fortune was a great woman willing to organize the fundraiser. She'd worn the deep green silk dress Jeffrey always complimented, the one that photographed beautifully and made her look regal in the society pages. The dress that made her feel elegant even when she felt hollow. But halfway through the dessert course, the ballroom began to blur at the edges. The pain started as a whisper behind her temples, then grew into something insistent, demanding. A tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the dress's tailored bodice. She'd made her excuses to the table of tech wives and venture capital spouses, kissed cheeks that smelled of perfume more expensive than some people's cars, promised to send donation checks she'd write from an account that bore Jeffrey's name but her signature. The drive home was a study in controlled breathing. Streetlights streaked past like falling stars. Her hands gripped the steering wheel of the Mercedes he bought her, sleek silver, appropriate for a billionaire's wife, and she focused on the white lines dividing the lanes because looking at anything else made the world tilt dangerously. The penthouse was dark when she arrived. Jeffrey had texted earlier, * working late. Big presentation tomorrow. Don't wait up. *. He'd left that afternoon for the office, kissed her forehead with the distracted affection of a man whose mind was already 3 meetings ahead. The kiss of someone going through motions, so practiced they'd become muscle memory. But earlier, before he'd left, Kim had seen him in their bedroom. Packing. Not the overnight duffel he used for late nights at the office, but the leather weekend bag. The one with the luggage tag from their honeymoon in Santorini, back when his kisses had lingered and his eyes had actually seen her. The bag wasn't by the door now. He'd taken it with him. Working late, the text had said. Kim kicked off her Louboutins. They hit the Italian marble with sharp, accusing clicks. Her feet ached. Her head throbbed. She wanted silence and darkness and maybe the bottle of wine Jeffrey's sommelier had recommended, the one she'd drink too fast because slow sipping required a calm she didn't possess. She moved toward the bedroom, then stopped. On the kitchen counter, catching the under-cabinet lighting like a white flag of surrender, sat a manila folder. Kim's heart didn't race. It dropped. Plummeted somewhere beneath the polished floor, past the foundation of their luxury building, down into the bedrock of Manhattan itself. She knew what it was before she touched it. Women always know. They feel betrayal the way sailors feel storms, a change in pressure, a shift in the wind, something fundamental in the atmosphere that screams danger even when the sky is still clear. The folder was expensive paper, the kind Jeffrey's attorney used. Embossed law firm logo. No sticky note. No explanation. Just her name on a tab, Kimberly Westover, dissolution of marriage. She didn't open it immediately. Instead, Kim stood in her designer kitchen, all marble and stainless steel and appliances that cost more than most people's annual salaries, and felt the room shrink around her. This kitchen where she'd hosted dinner parties for Jeffrey's investors. Where she'd laughed at their jokes and smiled at their wives and played the role of gracious hostess so perfectly that they'd called her the secret to Jeffrey's success. This kitchen where she'd imagined, in weak moments she never voiced, making breakfast for children. Messy, chaotic, beautiful mornings filled with spilled orange juice and laughter. The folder was cool beneath her fingertips when she finally opened it. Dissolution of marriage. Irreconcilable differences. Division of assets. Jeffrey's signature already elegantly scrawled at the bottom, confident as everything he did. A space for hers. Waiting. Empty. Expecting. Page 17 detailed the settlement. Generous, his lawyer had probably called it. The penthouse would remain his. She'd received the brownstone in Brooklyn they'd purchased as an investment and never lived in. A monthly allowance that sounded astronomical until you divided it by the years she'd spent building his image, entertaining his colleagues, being the polished accessory that made him look stable and trustworthy to investors. She'd get money. He'd keep the empire. She'd get the scraps of their life. He'd keep the feast. Kim's laugh surprised her, soft, broken, the sound of something valuable shattering in slow motion. Generous. As though she'd been charity instead of wife. As though her sacrifices had been invisible. As though the girl he'd married 7 years ago, the one who'd believed in him when he was just a programmer with a dream and a laptop, had never existed. The pain in her abdomen hit like a fist. Sharp. Immediate. Demanding attention the way Jeffrey's text messages did when they interrupted dinner, when they pulled him away mid-conversation, when they reminded her that she was always secondary to whatever empire he was building. Kim doubled over, hand pressing against her stomach, and the folder slipped from her fingers. Papers scattered across the marble like divorce confetti. She couldn't breathe properly. The room spun. The chandelier Jeffrey had insisted on, Venetian glass, $15,000, conversation piece, became a kaleidoscope of pain. She didn't call Jeffrey. Didn't call anyone. Kim grabbed her keys with shaking hands and drove herself to Mount Sinai, the hospital where Jeffrey's company had donated an entire wing. Where his name was literally on a plaque in the lobby. Where she'd attended ribbon-cutting ceremonies and smiled for photographers and pretended that the cold space between them was just the price of ambition. The emergency room was fluorescent bright and antiseptic cold. A nurse took her vitals. A doctor asked questions she answered through gritted teeth. They ran tests. Drew blood. Did an ultrasound she didn't understand the reason for until. Mrs. Westover. The doctor was young female, with kind eyes that had seen too much but hadn't hardened yet. She sat on the rolling stool and pulled it close to Kim's bed with the careful deliberation of someone about to deliver news that would change everything. "We need to talk about your test results." Kim's breath caught. Cancer, she thought. Stress-induced cardiac event. Some betrayal of her body to match the betrayal of her marriage. "You're pregnant," the doctor said softly. Then paused, checking the tablet in her hands as though confirming a miracle. Approximately 9 weeks. And Mrs. Westover. The doctor looked up, and something in her expression made Kim's world stop rotating. You're carrying twins. The monitors beeped. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere in the hospital, someone's baby was being born and someone else was dying, and the world was spinning exactly as it always had. But Kim's world had just detonated. Twins. Jeffrey, who'd said he wasn't ready for children. Who'd shifted the conversation every time she'd mentioned starting a family. Who'd insisted timing mattered, business first, legacy later, always later. Jeffrey, who'd just filed for divorce without even the courage to hand her the papers himself. Jeffrey, who'd packed a weekend bag and lied about working late. Jeffrey, who had no idea that the wife he was discarding carried the only legacy his name would ever truly need. Kim's hand moved to her abdomen. Flat still. Showing nothing. Hiding everything. Mrs. Westover? Are you all right? Should I call your husband? Kim's laugh returned, but different this time. Not broken. Sharp. The sound of a blade being sharpened. No, she whispered, her voice steady for the first time since finding those papers. Don't call him. Not yet. Because something had shifted in that hospital room. Some fundamental rebalancing of power that Jeffrey, brilliant, strategic, always 3 steps ahead Jeffrey, had never seen coming. He thought he was divorcing his wife. He had no idea he'd just created his most dangerous adversary. And she wasn't screaming. Wasn't crying. Wasn't begging him to reconsider. Kim Westover was doing something far more dangerous. She was thinking. Kim had been elegance wrapped in quiet fire long before Jeffrey Westover discovered her. She'd been 23, fresh from Columbia Business School, working at her father's biotech firm in a position everyone assumed was nepotism, but which she'd earned through 16-hour days and a thesis on pharmaceutical investment strategies that had been cited in 3 major journals. Her father, Marcus Chun, was a man who'd built his empire without ever appearing in Forbes. Old money people called him, though that wasn't quite accurate. Strategic money was more precise. Invisible money. The kind that funded breakthrough research and owned patents that other companies didn't know they needed until they were already dependent on them. Marcus had taught Kim that power wasn't about being loud. It was about being necessary. Jeffrey had come to pitch Marcus on funding for his AI medical diagnostics platform. 28 years old, Harvard dropout, too confident by half. He'd worn a suit that didn't quite fit and presented slides that were brilliant but disorganized. Kim had been taking notes in the back of the conference room, as she always did during her father's pitch meetings. She'd watched Jeffrey stumble through technical explanations, seen Marcus's interest fade, watched the deal dying in real time. And she'd done something she rarely did. She'd spoken up. The technology isn't the product, she'd said, her voice cutting through Jeffrey's desperate rambling. The peace of mind is. You're not selling diagnostics. You're selling parents the ability to sleep at night because they know their child's symptoms were analyzed by something smarter than Dr. Google. The room had gone silent. Marcus had looked at his daughter with something like pride. And Jeffrey had looked at her like she'd just solved an equation he'd been struggling with for months. They'd funded him. 40% equity for $12 million. Structured over 3 rounds with milestone triggers. Standard terms. Except for Clause 17, buried on page 43, which Marcus always included in family investments. In the event of founder divorce prior to 5-year vesting completion, non-founding spouse retains right to equity reversion of initial investment percentage. Kim hadn't thought about that clause when Jeffrey proposed to her 14 months later. Hadn't thought about it when they'd married in a ceremony that made the Times wedding section. Hadn't thought about it during the 7 years of building his empire while slowly erasing herself. But she was thinking about it now. Kim checked herself out of Mount Sinai at 3 a.m., against the doctor's gentle protests. She needed to think, and thinking required solitude. Required the absence of monitors beeping and nurses checking vitals and the risk of Jeffrey somehow finding out she was there. The October air was cold when she stepped onto Fifth Avenue, her emerald dress utterly inappropriate for the temperature. But Kim had stopped caring about appropriate the moment she'd opened that manila folder. She didn't go back to the penthouse. Couldn't face that kitchen, those papers, that chandelier glittering above the ruins of her marriage. Instead, she drove to Brooklyn. To the brownstone Jeffrey had bought as an investment property, and never visited. For stories of potential he'd never bothered to realize because Brooklyn wasn't Manhattan, wasn't prestigious enough, wasn't the address that impressed his Silicon Valley friends. The house was empty but not abandoned. Kim had a cleaning service maintain it, had kept it staged with furniture and art, had treated it like the home it could be even though Jeffrey treated it like a line item on a tax return. She let herself in, kicked off the Louboutins she'd somehow kept wearing, and stood in the living room as dawn began painting the windows gold. Her phone buzzed. Jeffrey, asterisk, where are you? You didn't come home. Asterisk. Not are you okay? Not I'm worried. Just the faint irritation of a man whose routine had been disrupted. Kim didn't respond. Instead, she walked to the window and placed her hand against her stomach. Still flat. Still secret. Still hers alone to know. She thought about the divorce papers. The weekend bag. The working late text that was certainly a lie. She thought about 7 years of marriage. 7 years of being Mrs. Jeffrey Westover. 7 years of attending his events, entertaining his colleagues, being the polished proof that he was stable enough to trust with billions of dollars in venture capital. 7 years of asking when they'd start a family and hearing soon Kim, just not yet. But not yet had apparently meant never, because you didn't file for divorce if you wanted children with someone. Kim had been patient. Understanding. The good wife who prioritized her husband's empire building over her own desires. And she'd been rewarded with abandonment. With papers on a counter. With a space for her signature on her own erasure. But Jeffrey had made one miscalculation. He'd underestimated the girl he'd met in that conference room. The one who'd seen through his pitch to the real product underneath. The one Marcus Chun had raised to understand that power wasn't about volume, it was about position. Kim pulled out her phone and opened a text she hadn't sent in months. Asterisk, Dad. Need to talk. It's important. Asterisk. His response came within seconds, despite the 6 a.m. hour. Asterisk, my office. 1 hour. Asterisk. She'd tell him about the divorce. But not yet about the twins. That information was leverage, and Kim had learned from the best that you never revealed your strongest card until you'd already won the hand. The sun rose fully over Brooklyn, painting the brownstone's walls in shades of gold and amber. In the window glass, Kim caught her reflection, emerald dress wrinkled, makeup smudged, hair falling from its elegant updo. She looked destroyed. But when she smiled, there was something new in her expression. Something cold and sharp and utterly focused. Jeffrey thought he was divorcing his wife. He had no idea he'd just armed his enemy. Marcus Chen's office was in a building so understated that most people walked past it without noticing. No logo on the door. No company name in the lobby directory. Just a floor number and a security system that used retinal scanners. Kim arrived at 7:30, still wearing last night's gala dress. The security guard, who'd known her since she was a teenager visiting her father's work, didn't comment on her appearance, just nodded her toward the private elevator. Marcus was reviewing financial reports when she entered, his silver hair immaculate despite the early hour, his suit perfect despite having probably slept in his office chair. He looked up when she walked in, and his expression shifted from neutral to concerned in the fraction of a second before he controlled it. Kimberly. He never called her Kim. Never used nicknames or diminutives. His daughter was Kimberly, full name, full respect, full expectation of excellence. He filed for divorce, she said, because there was no point in building up to it. Marcus Chin didn't do small talk, even with his daughter. Especially with his daughter. Marcus set down his tablet. When? Yesterday. Left the papers on the counter. Didn't even have the courage to hand them to me personally. How generous is the settlement? Sufficiently insulting. Kim sat in the leather chair across from his desk, the same chair where she'd sat during her childhood, listening to her father explain market forces and investment strategies like bedtime stories. He keeps the empire. I get the scraps and a monthly allowance that assumes I'll fade into grateful obscurity. And Clause 17. Kim met her father's eyes. I was hoping you'd remember that. Marcus smiled. It was the expression he wore when a biotech pitch revealed breakthrough potential. When an investment thesis proved correct. When an opponent revealed they'd underestimated him. The 5-year vesting anniversary is in 4 months, he said softly. He's filing now to avoid triggering the equity reversion. But the clause specifies 5 years from marriage, not 5 years from final investment round. Which means he's already in violation if he finalizes the divorce. Marcus leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. 40% of his initial shares revert to your control. That's approximately $4 billion at current valuation, Kim finished. And board voting rights he can't simply buy back without triggering hostile takeover provisions. Father and daughter looked at each other across the desk. 7 years ago, Marcus had structured that investment not just to fund Jeffrey's company, but to protect his daughter in case the confident young man turned out to be the careless husband he suspected. "There's more," Kim said quietly. Marcus waited. "I'm pregnant. With twins. 9 weeks." For the first time in Kim's memory, her father's composure cracked. His eyes widened. His hands unfolded. He stood, walked around the desk, and pulled her into an embrace that smelled of expensive cologne and old books and safety. "Does he know?" "No. I found out last night. Hours after finding the divorce papers." Marcus pulled back, hands on her shoulders, looking at her with an intensity that had intimidated Fortune 500 CEOs. "What do you want, Kimberly? Not what's fair. Not what's strategic. What do you want?" Kim thought about the penthouse that had never felt like home. About charity galas and investor dinners and being the perfect accessory. About 7 years of being Mrs. Jeffrey Westover instead of just Kim. "I want my life back," she whispered. "And I want him to understand exactly what he tried to throw away." Marcus smiled again. "Then let's negotiate your freedom." Marcus Chun had taught his daughter many things, but the most important lesson came when Kim was 12 years old. They'd been sitting in his study, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson, walls lined with first-edition medical journals and patent certificates framed like art. A venture capitalist had just left after a contentious meeting, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. "Dad, why didn't you get angry?" Kim had asked, confused by her father's calm throughout the man's theatrical rage. "He said terrible things about your company." Marcus had looked up from the contract he was reviewing, his reading glasses catching the afternoon light. "Kimberly, anger is what people perform when they have no power. I don't need to raise my voice. I own 40% of his most profitable investment. His anger is just noise. My silence is a weapon." That memory surfaced now as Kim sat across from her father in his office, 23 years later, watching him process the news of her pregnancy with the same measured calm he'd shown that day. "Jeffrey doesn't know?" Marcus asked again, as though confirming the strategic landscape. "No one knows except you, me, and a doctor bound by HIPAA." Marcus stood and walked to his window, hands clasped behind his back, the posture of a man who'd built empires without ever appearing on a magazine cover. Kim had inherited his coloring, his sharp mind, his ability to remain utterly still while the world burned around him. "Tell me about the cracks," he said quietly. "When did you first notice?" Kim closed her eyes. The question hurt because the answer was, she'd noticed for longer than she'd admitted to herself. "The dinners," she began. "He stopped coming home for them about 8 months ago. At first, it was once a week, board meetings running late, investor calls with Tokyo, emergencies that always seemed to happen right at 6 o'clock. And you believed him?" "I wanted to." Kim's hand moved unconsciously to her abdomen. "Then it became 3 times a week. Then 5. Then he stopped texting to cancel, just didn't come home until I was already asleep." Marcus turned from the window. "What else?" "The investor trips." Kim's voice was steadier now, cataloging evidence the way her father had taught her to analyze data. "They increased. Used to be once a quarter, maybe twice. Standard for his position. But this year, 14 trips. I counted. Monaco. 2 months ago. Tech Summit, he said. 5 days. He posted photos with the Crown Prince, with the CEO of that European aerospace company. All the right people." Kim pulled out her phone, scrolled to the saved images. "But look at the background of this one. The restaurant shot." Marcus took her phone, zoomed in. In the soft focus background of Jeffrey's professional networking photo, barely visible through the champagne glasses and floral arrangements, was a woman. Young blonde, laughing at something off camera. Her hand on the back of a chair, Jeffrey's chair. She's in 3 other photos, Kim continued. Always just out of frame. Always positioned like she's part of the group but never tagged, never identified, never acknowledged. You researched her? Scarlett Devereux, 28. Daughter of Pierre Devereux, the venture capitalist who funded Jeffrey's Series B round. Columbia MBA, currently consulting for her father's firm. Kim's laugh was bitter. She posted a photo from Monaco the same week. Same restaurant. Same view. But Jeffrey's not in her photos either. Marcus handed back the phone, his expression unreadable. They're being careful. They're being obvious to anyone who's looking. I just wasn't looking until I found the divorce papers. The office fell silent except for the hum of the city beyond the windows. Marcus returned to his desk, opened a locked drawer, and pulled out a thin file. I had her investigated 3 months ago, he said quietly. Kim's head snapped up. What? I'm your father, Kimberly. You think I don't notice when my daughter stops smiling in photographs? When her eyes go distant during family dinners? When she starts losing weight not from wellness but from worry? Marcus slid the file across the desk. Jeffrey's been seeing her for 7 months. Since the New York Tech Summit in March. Kim opened the file with shaking hands. Inside, printed emails discussing discretion and timing. Hotel receipts from 4 different cities. A photograph of Jeffrey and Scarlett entering a townhouse in Tribeca at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, the same Tuesday he texted Kim saying he was working late at the office. Why didn't you tell me? Kim's voice cracked. Because you needed to discover it yourself. Needed to feel the betrayal firsthand, not hear it secondhand from your father. Fury inherited from others burns fast and dies. Fury you earn yourself. Marcus leaned forward. That becomes fuel. Kim stared at the evidence of her husband's systematic dismantling of their marriage. 7 months. While she'd been planning their anniversary trip. While she'd been consulting fertility specialists. While she'd been loving a man who'd already emotionally divorced her. The timing of his filing isn't random, Marcus continued. He wants to marry her before the 5-year clause triggers. Wants to present his investors with a new wife younger, connected to European capital, from tech royalty. He thinks she's an upgrade. An upgrade. Kim's voice was hollow. In his mind, yes. Scarlett's father controls $3 billion in venture capital across 12 funds. Her family owns chateaux in France and penthouses in London. She speaks 4 languages and has an MBA from a school that matters to men like Jeffrey. Marcus paused. And she's not asking him about children. The words hit like a physical blow. Kim had asked. Had mentioned it casually at first, then more directly. Had left fertility brochures on the counter, had suggested they stop trying to prevent and start trying to create. And Jeffrey had always had a reason to wait. The company was at a crucial stage. The market was volatile. They had time. Always more time. But he'd never planned to have children with her. He'd just been waiting for the right moment to trade her in. There's more, Marcus said, his voice harder now. He's already introduced her to his board. Informally, at a private dinner last month. Tested the waters. They're enthusiastic. Of course they are. Kim's hand pressed harder against her stomach, where 2 lives Jeffrey didn't know about were growing. She probably doesn't challenge him. Doesn't question his late nights or his priorities. Just smiles and networks and makes him look good. Everything he thought he had with you, but without the complication of a wife who's intelligent enough to see through him. Kim looked up at her father, tears finally breaking through. When did I become a complication? Marcus's expression softened. The moment you stopped being useful to his ambitions and started having ambitions of your own. Men like Jeffrey don't want partners. They want accessories that appreciate in value. That night, Kim returned to the hospital for the follow-up appointment the doctor had insisted on. They checked her vitals, did another ultrasound, confirmed what she already knew in her bones. 2 heartbeats, strong and steady, completely unaware of the war their existence had just triggered. She lay on the examination table after the doctor left, hands spread across her still flat abdomen, staring at the ultrasound image on the screen. 2 gray blobs that would become people. Her people. Children who would carry Jeffrey's name but would be raised with her values, her strength, her refusal to let powerful men define her worth. Kim thought about Scarlett Devereux, 28, polished, perfect, positioned to be the next Mrs. Westover. Thought about Jeffrey walking away from 7 years of marriage for a woman who represented better connections, better optics, better positioning in the social hierarchy he worshipped. He'd planned this. The Monaco trip hadn't been random. The increasing distance hadn't been stress. The refused conversations about children hadn't been about timing. Jeffrey had been systematically preparing to replace her. And he would have succeeded, would have filed, divorced, remarried, and moved on with his upgrade, his empire intact, his reputation untarnished, if not for one miscalculation. The two lives currently measuring 63 and 65 millimeters on the ultrasound screen. The legacy he'd created but would never control. The children he didn't want with her but couldn't now escape. For the first time since finding those divorce papers, Kim felt something other than devastation. She felt power. Not the borrowed power of being Mrs. Jeffrey Westover. Not the reflected power of standing beside a billionaire at charity galas. But her own power, primal, fierce, absolute. The power of a woman carrying the future of a man who'd tried to erase her past. Jeffrey thought he was trading up. Thought he was making a strategic move, positioning himself for the next phase of his empire building with a wife who came with better connections and fewer complications. He didn't know he'd just given his greatest weapon to the woman he was trying to discard. Kim smiled in the empty hospital room, hands still pressed against her stomach. "He has no idea what's coming," she whispered to the lives growing inside her. "But we do, don't we?" The ultrasound machine hummed. The monitor beeped steadily. And somewhere across the city, Jeffrey Westover was probably with Scarlett Devereux, celebrating the divorce filing, planning his future, congratulating himself on a clean escape. Kim pressed the ultrasound printout to her chest and felt the first spark of something that wasn't quite revenge but was far more dangerous. Strategy. Doctor. Sarah Mitchell had the kind of face that made people confess their deepest fears. Warm brown eyes, steady hands, a voice like honey over steel. She delivered over 3,000 babies in her 15-year career at Mount Sinai, but something about Kim Westover made her pause. The woman sitting before her wasn't crying. Wasn't panicking. Wasn't asking the frantic questions most women asked when learning they were carrying twins. Kim was calculating. "You're further along than we initially thought," Dr. Mitchell said, pulling her stool closer to the examination table. The ultrasound images glowed on the screen behind her, two small forms, hearts flickering like distant stars. "Based on these measurements and your hormone levels, I'd estimate 11 weeks, possibly 12. Not 9. Kim's hand pressed harder against her abdomen. 11 weeks. That meant the Monaco trip, she whispered. Dr. Mitchell tilted her head, compassionate but professional. "I'm sorry." "Nothing." Kim's mind was racing, rewinding through calendar dates she'd memorized without meaning to. 11 weeks ago, Jeffrey had returned from Monaco. Had crawled into bed at 3 in the morning, smelling of airplane recycled air and expensive cologne. Had pulled her close in his sleep, the way he used to when they were new. She'd thought it was affection. Nostalgia for what they'd been. Now she understood. It had been guilt. The kind of guilt that made men pretend intimacy with wives they were already planning to abandon. He'd touched her that night like he was saying goodbye. She just hadn't known it yet. "Mrs. Westover?" Dr. Mitchell's voice pulled her back. "I need to ask, does your husband know about the pregnancy?" Kim met the doctor's eyes. Kind, concerned, assuming the answer would be yes. Assuming husbands were partners, not adversaries. Assuming marriages were safe spaces instead of battlefields. "No," Kim said quietly. "And I'm not sure I'm going to tell him." Dr. Mitchell's professional mask slipped for just a moment, surprise, then understanding, then careful neutrality. She'd been doing this long enough to recognize the specific silence of women trapped between truth and survival. "That's your choice," she said carefully. "But I should inform you that your medical records are protected by HIPAA unless I provide written consent for release." Kim's voice was steady. "Which I won't be doing. Not yet." The doctor nodded slowly. "Of course. Your privacy is paramount." She paused, then added more softly, "But Kim, may I call you Kim? Please. You're going to need support. Twins are high risk. You'll need regular monitoring, dietary adjustments, possibly bed rest in the third trimester. This isn't something you can hide forever. I don't need forever, Kim said, something cold and sharp settling in her chest. I just need long enough. Her phone rang as Dr. Mitchell was writing prescriptions for prenatal vitamins. Kim glanced at the screen. Amanda Pierce, Westover Industries. Jeffrey's head of communications. The woman who managed his image with the precision of a military strategist, who'd once told Kim at a company party that maintaining narrative control was more important than truth. Kim let it ring. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then answered with a voice she'd perfected over 7 years of being Mrs. Jeffrey Westover, warm, gracious, utterly unthreatening. Amanda. How are you? Kim. Oh, thank God. Amanda's relief was almost convincing. Almost. We heard you were hospitalized. Jeffrey's been trying to reach you. Has he? Not a question. Kim watched Dr. Mitchell pretend not to listen while organizing medical supplies across the room. He's incredibly worried. We all are. What happened? Are you all right? We. As though Jeffrey's PR team was a concerned family instead of a damage control machine already spinning potential scandals into acceptable narratives. I'm fine, Kim said, her voice light as champagne and twice as empty. Just exhausted. You know how these charity events are, too much standing, not enough water. Of course, of course. Amanda's tone shifted, became more probing. But the hospital stay seems, they usually don't admit people for simple dehydration. Is there anything we should know about? Anything that might surface unexpectedly? There it was. The real question hiding beneath concern's mask. Are you about to become a scandal? Are you going to embarrass Jeffrey? Are you a liability we need to manage? Kim smiled at the wall, imagining Amanda's face when the truth finally detonated. When she learned that the exhausted wife they were already writing off as collateral damage was carrying the only thing Jeffrey Westover actually valued. His legacy. His bloodline. His immortality. Nothing to worry about, Kim said sweetly. Just a fainting spell. Stress, probably. You know, marriage has its challenges. The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds too long. Right. Of course. Well, we're so relieved you're okay. When you're feeling better, perhaps we could schedule lunch. Just us girls. I'd love to catch up. Translation. I need to assess how much you know and how much of a problem you're going to be. That sounds lovely, Kim lied. I'll call you when I'm back on my feet. She hung up before Amanda could respond, then turned off her phone entirely. Dr. Mitchell was looking at her with something like recognition. PR team. How did you know? I've been delivering babies to powerful families for a long time. I know the difference between people who care and people who manage. She handed Kim a folder of information about twin pregnancies. Whatever you're dealing with, Kim, remember, you're not alone. And you're stronger than you think. Kim accepted the folder, thinking about strength. About how she'd been strong the wrong way for years, strong enough to smile through loneliness, strong enough to ignore betrayal, strong enough to love a man who'd stopped seeing her. But this was different strength. Colder. Sharper. The kind that didn't bend, it broke things. The memory ambushed her as she sat in the hospital waiting room, filling out discharge paperwork. 6 weeks ago. Maybe 7. A dinner at home, rare enough to be notable. Jeffrey had actually made it back before 9 o'clock, had loosened his tie and poured wine and settled across from her at the table like they were still people who chose to be together. Kim had made his favorite meal. Had lit candles. Had thought maybe, finally, they could talk about the future she wanted. The one with smaller hands and louder mornings and love that multiplied instead of divided. I've been thinking, she'd said, voice careful, testing the water's temperature. About starting a family. Jeffrey had looked up from his phone, actually looked up, which should have been her first warning that the answer was rehearsed. Kim. He'd set down his fork with the precision of a man delivering bad news to shareholders. We've discussed this. The company's at a critical stage. I need to stay focused. Children require love, she'd interrupted, something desperate breaking through her careful tone. Attention? The same things marriages require. His expression had cooled. That's not fair. Neither is waiting forever for a life you keep promising will start later. I didn't realize you were issuing ultimatums. I'm not. She'd stopped, swallowed the rest of the sentence. I'm just tired of being secondary. I'm just tired of feeling like a placeholder. I'm just tired of loving someone who treats our future like a quarterly goal he'll get to eventually. But she hadn't said any of that. Had just smiled sadly and cleared the plates and pretended the conversation had been about timing instead of what it really was, Jeffrey telling her she wasn't important enough to interrupt his ambitions for. Now, sitting in Mount Sinai with his children growing inside her, Kim understood something she should have seen then. Jeffrey didn't want children with her. He wanted children after her. With whoever came next. With Scarlett Devereux probably, the upgrade with better connections and fewer complications. He'd been planning his exit even then. The divorce papers hadn't been sudden. They'd been inevitable. But so was this. Kim stood, walked to the nurse's station with the calm of a woman who'd just discovered she held every card in a game her husband thought he was winning. I'd like my discharge papers, please, she said. The nurse looked up, started to say something about doctor's orders and observation periods and being careful. But something in Kim's expression made her stop. Made her simply nod and process the paperwork without argument. Because the woman standing before her wasn't the same one who'd arrived hours ago, broken, betrayed, discarded. This woman was armored in purpose. Crowned in certainty. This woman was carrying the only legacy Jeffrey Westover's empire truly needed. And she'd just decided exactly what that was worth. Marcus Chen's office existed in that rare space where old money met new power without either one announcing itself. No gold nameplates. No magazine covers framed on walls. No Bloomberg terminals flashing numbers that measured worth in real time. Just floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson, shelves lined with first-edition medical journals, and furniture so expensive it looked almost plain. Kim arrived at 7 in the morning, still wearing yesterday's emerald dress, carrying the hospital discharge papers folded in her purse like evidence of a crime not yet committed. Her father was already there. He was always already there. Marcus didn't sleep so much as pause, brief periods of stillness between the kind of strategic thinking that had built empires most people didn't know existed. He looked up when she entered. Didn't ask why she was early or why she looked like she hadn't slept or why her eyes held the particular emptiness that comes after crying but before healing. He just stood, walked around his desk, and pulled her into an embrace that smelled like expensive cologne and safety and every childhood memory of being protected by a man who understood power better than anyone she'd ever known. Tell me, he said quietly. So she did. Kim told him about the charity gala, the dizziness, the drive home. About the manila folder on the marble counter, papers already signed, space for her signature waiting like an execution order. About Jeffrey's text claiming he was working late while his weekend bag disappeared and his carefully constructed lies crumbled under the weight of their own precision. She told him about the hospital. About the pain and the panic and the doctor's voice saying words that had rewritten her entire future in a single breath. But she didn't tell him about the twins. Not yet. That information was a weapon, and Marcus had taught her long ago, you never reveal your weapons until you know exactly where to aim them. Her father listened without interrupting. Without the performative anger most men displayed when their daughters were wounded. Marcus Chen didn't perform anything. He calculated, assessed, planned. When Kim finished, the silence stretched between them like a contract being drafted in real time. The 5-year anniversary, Marcus said finally, his voice as calm as if discussing market trends, is in 4 months. I know. He's filing now to avoid triggering Clause 17. Kim's breath caught. I'd forgotten about that. He's counting on you forgetting. Marcus walked to his desk, opened a locked drawer, and pulled out a folder so thin it looked insignificant. The kind of thing that could change everything while weighing almost nothing. He laid it on the desk between them. The initial investment contract. $40 million for 40% equity, structured over 3 rounds with milestone triggers. His finger traced down to page 43. To a paragraph buried in legal language most people would skim past. Clause 17, protective provision for family investments. Kim leaned forward, reading words she'd seen years ago but hadn't understood the full weight of. Legal language that seemed standard boilerplate, the kind of thing lawyers added to contracts because other lawyers expected it. But Marcus Chen never did anything standard. In the event of founder divorce prior to completion of 5-year vesting period from date of marriage, non-founding spouse retains right to equity reversion of initial investment percentage, calculated at current valuation, with accompanying board representation and voting rights non-transferable, except through mutual written consent of all parties. Kim read it twice. 3 times. Each word landing like a chess piece being positioned on a board Jeffrey thought he controlled. He thinks the 5 years refers to the investment vesting schedule, she whispered. Most people would. Marcus's smile was the kind sharks wore. But the contract specifies from date of marriage, not from final funding round. A deliberate ambiguity I included because I've seen men like Jeffrey before. Brilliant with code, blind to consequence. Kim did the math in her head, the kind of calculation she'd learned at her father's knee, taught the same way other girls learn to braid hair or bake cookies. 40% of Jeffrey's shares at current valuation. $4 billion. Plus board voting rights. Plus the ability to influence every major company decision. Plus the power to make Jeffrey Westover answer to the wife he was trying to discard like outdated software. If he finalizes the divorce before the 5-year anniversary. The clause triggers automatically. The shares revert. He loses control of his own company. Marcus leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, watching his daughter process the gift he'd hidden in contract language 7 years ago. I structured it that way to protect you. In case the confident young man with the brilliant pitch turned out to be the careless husband I suspected he might become. Kim's hand moved unconsciously to her abdomen. Flat still. Secret still. Growing more powerful by the hour. Does he know? She asked. He signed the contract. Whether he read it carefully enough to understand it. Marcus shrugged. Men like Jeffrey skim protective provisions. They assume the protections are for investors, not wives. They never imagine the woman standing beside them at the signing might someday become their greatest adversary. Kim absorbed this in the silence that was her signature, the quiet that made people underestimate her, assume she was fragile when she was actually calculating trajectory and impact and exactly where to aim when the moment came. Her father had taught her this. Had raised her in boardrooms and negotiation tables and moments like these where power shifted not through volume but through position. What do you want me to do? Marcus asked softly. Kim looked at her father, the man who'd built empires without ever raising his voice, who'd taught her that true power was being necessary rather than loud, who'd protected her before she even knew she needed protection. Nothing, she said. Not yet. Across the city, in a restaurant where reservations required 6 weeks' notice and discretion was more valuable than the Michelin stars, Jeffrey Westover was celebrating. He sat across from Scarlett Devereux, 28, blonde, perfectly positioned to be the next Mrs. Westover in every way that mattered to men who measured worth in connections and appearances. To new beginnings, Jeffrey said, raising his champagne glass. Scarlett smiled, the kind of smile that had probably launched 1,000 investment deals and broken twice as many hearts. You filed. Yesterday. Clean, simple, generous settlement. She'll be fine. And the company? Untouchable. I had legal review every possible challenge. The prenup is airtight. The shares are protected. Kim gets the Brooklyn property, a monthly allowance, and the satisfaction of knowing she was married to a billionaire for 7 years. Jeffrey's confidence was absolute. By the time the divorce is final, you and I can start planning something more permanent. Scarlett leaned forward, her hand covering his. Your father approves? He will. Once he sees how this positions us with European capital. Your father's network, my technology, our families united. Jeffrey smiled. It's better than love. It's strategy. He had no idea that across the city, in an office with no name on the door, his wife was learning exactly what strategy looked like when built by someone who actually understood power. He had no idea about the twins. About the clause. About the quiet fury of a woman who'd spent 7 years being underestimated and had finally decided to show him the cost of that assumption. Jeffrey Westover raised his champagne glass, toasting a future he thought he controlled. He had no idea the foundation was already crumbling. Kim stood at her father's window, looking out over the Hudson as dawn painted the water gold and amber. Behind her, Marcus waited. Patient. Present. Ready to deploy whatever weapons she decided to use. The twins, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm carrying his children. 2 of them. He doesn't know. The silence that followed was profound. Then Marcus's hand on her shoulder, steady, certain, absolutely lethal in its gentleness. Then you hold everything he values and everything he fears, Marcus said quietly. His legacy. His reputation. His carefully constructed future. All of it in your hands now. Kim turned to face her father, and something in her expression had shifted. The devastated wife from yesterday was gone. In her place stood something colder, sharper, infinitely more dangerous. A woman who'd been underestimated her entire marriage. A woman who'd just learned she held $4 billion worth of leverage and 2 lives Jeffrey didn't know existed. A woman who'd been taught by Marcus Chun that power wasn't about making noise, it was about making moves no one saw coming. I want him to understand exactly what he tried to throw away, Kim whispered. Her father smiled. Then let's teach him. Jeffrey heard about the hospitalization from Amanda Pierce at 10:47 a.m., during a board meeting where he was presenting Q4 projections that would make shareholders weep with joy. His phone buzzed. He ignored it. Buzzed again. He glanced down, saw Amanda's name, and nearly sent it to voicemail before something in the message preview made his blood go cold. Kim hospitalized at Mount Sinai last night. No details released. Media already asking questions. The presentation continued around him, voices discussing market penetration and revenue streams and competitive advantages, but Jeffrey wasn't hearing any of it. His mind had shifted into the mode that had built his empire: crisis assessment, damage control, strategic positioning. Hospitalized. Kim never got sick. Never missed events. Never caused problems that required management. That was the entire point of Kim. She was the controlled variable in his carefully calculated life. Beautiful, appropriate, utterly predictable. Except now she was in a hospital, and the media was asking questions, and Jeffrey's carefully constructed narrative about an amicable separation was approximately 5 news cycles away from becoming a scandal about a billionaire who'd abandoned his wife in a medical crisis. He excused himself from the meeting with the kind of smooth confidence that made board members trust him to handle anything. Walked to his office. Closed the door. Called Amanda. What happened? We don't know. She's not returning calls. The hospital won't confirm anything beyond that she was admitted and later discharged. But Jeffrey, Amanda's voice dropped to the tone she used when delivering truly bad news. TMZ already has photos of her arriving. Evening gown, no coat, looking. She paused, searching for the right word. Devastated. Jeffrey closed his eyes. Saw the optics immediately. Billionaire files for divorce. Wife collapses the same night. Appears at hospital alone and broken. The narrative practically wrote itself, and none of it made him look like the visionary leader investors trusted with their billions. I need to see her, he said. Is that wise? Given the divorce. Amanda, I need to manage her. Find out what happened. Make sure she's not about to do something that makes both of us look bad. Jeffrey was already grabbing his coat, his keys, his mask of concerned husband that he could wear when necessary. Where is she now? Unknown. She's not at the penthouse. We tried. Keep trying. And Amanda? Make sure our lawyers know there might be complications. He hung up before she could ask what kind. Jeffrey found her at Mount Sinai 3 hours later, after calling in favors with hospital administrators and leveraging the Westover name on the lobby plaque his donation had purchased. Dr. Mitchell tried to stop him. Mr. Westover, your wife specifically requested no visitors. I'm her husband. He smiled, the one that had charmed investors and journalists and anyone who didn't look too closely at the coldness beneath it. I'm sure she didn't mean me. The doctor's expression suggested Kim had meant exactly him, but Jeffrey was already moving past her, following directions to the private recovery room where Kim had apparently returned for follow-up tests. He found her standing at the window. The late afternoon sun poured through the glass, gold and amber and almost painfully beautiful, that specific autumn light that made Manhattan look like a painting. It caught in Kim's dark hair, still perfect despite everything, and painted her skin in shades of warmth that contrasted sharply with the hospital's cold white walls and sterile floors. She wore a simple dress, not the emerald gown from the photos, but something soft and dove-gray that made her look smaller somehow. Vulnerable. Her hand rested on her abdomen in a gesture so subtle Jeffrey almost missed it. Almost. Kim. She turned slowly, and Jeffrey felt something shift in his chest at her expression. No tears. No anger. Just a calm that was somehow more terrifying than any emotional outburst would have been. Jeffrey. Her voice was steady. Amanda's persistence finally paid off. I was worried. He stepped closer, activating the concerned husband performance he'd perfected over 7 years. You were hospitalized. You wouldn't return my calls. I didn't know if I was dying. Kim's laugh was soft, almost affectionate. No. Not dying. Quite the opposite, actually. Jeffrey froze at something in her tone. That hand on her abdomen. The way she was looking at him, not with the devastation he'd expected, but with something that looked almost like triumph. What does that mean? Kim turned back to the window, silhouetted against that golden light like something from a Renaissance painting. When she spoke, her voice was calm enough to stop his heart. I'm pregnant, Jeffrey. 11 weeks. With twins. The world didn't stop. That would have been merciful. Instead, it kept spinning while Jeffrey's brain tried to process words that couldn't possibly mean what they clearly meant. Pregnant. Twins. His. That's not, he stopped, did the math, felt his carefully constructed future crumbling in real time. That's not possible. We haven't. Monaco, Kim said quietly. 11 weeks ago. You came home late from your trip. Crawled into bed at 3 in the morning. You held me like you used to. I thought it was affection. She glanced at him over her shoulder. It was guilt, wasn't it? You'd already decided to leave. Already met her. Already started planning your exit. But that night you pretended we were still us. Jeffrey's hands had gone numb. His whole body felt numb. Because she was right, he remembered that night, remembered the guilt that had made him reach for her, the nostalgia for what they'd been before ambition had poisoned everything. And now. The divorce, he whispered. Yes. About that. Kim turned to face him fully, and in the golden light streaming through the window, she looked like something more than his wife. She looked like a force of nature he'd forgotten existed. I received the papers. I believe you left them on the kitchen counter? Such a thoughtful delivery method. Kim, wait. No, Jeffrey. You've made me wait for 7 years. 7 years of not yet and soon, and after this deal closes. 7 years of being told that children were something we discuss later, when you were less busy building your empire. Her hand pressed harder against her abdomen. Turns out later came sooner than you planned. Jeffrey's mind was racing through scenarios, calculations, damage control, the board, the investors, his father. The carefully constructed narrative about upgrading to Scarlett Devereux, younger, better connected, strategically perfect. All of it destroyed by 2 lives he hadn't wanted. By a wife he'd already discarded. By a truth he couldn't manage or spin or make disappear. We can work this out, he said, shifting into negotiation mode because that was the only language he truly spoke fluently. The divorce, we can delay it. Restructure the terms. I'll be involved with the children, we can co-parent. I'll make sure you have everything you need. Everything I need. Kim's laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. Jeffrey, you filed for divorce without telling me. You packed a bag and lied about working late. You've been planning this exit for months, while I was planning our anniversary trip. And now you think you can restructure the terms. Kim, please. No. The word was quiet. Final. Absolute. I've spent 7 years saying yes to you. Yes to late dinners alone. Yes to investor trips that lasted longer than our honeymoon. Yes to waiting for children until your company was more stable, your portfolio more diversified, your empire more secure. Yes to being Mrs. Jeffrey Westover instead of just Kim. She walked toward him, and Jeffrey found himself stepping back despite having 6 inches and 60 pounds on her. But I'm done saying yes to a man who treats me like a line item on a balance sheet. You don't understand what you're doing. Jeffrey's voice had gone desperate, the smooth confidence cracking. The company, my reputation, the investors, they'll ask questions. My father will. Your father will what? Kim tilted her head, something almost curious in her expression. Be disappointed that his son abandoned a pregnant wife? That you filed for divorce without even having the courage to hand me the papers yourself? That you're already planning to marry someone else before you've even finalized breaking vows to me? Jeffrey's blood went cold. How did you? Monaco wasn't just about guilt, was it? It was about her. Scarlett Devereux, venture capitalist's daughter, 28 years old. Perfect pedigree. Better connections. Kim's smile was gentle, devastating. You think I didn't notice her in your photos? Always just out of frame, carefully cropped from the official shots, but there in the background if anyone looked closely enough. Kim. I'm not angry, Jeffrey. And the terrifying thing was, she sounded like she meant it. I'm grateful. Because you filing for divorce freed me from the obligation of loving a man who stopped seeing me years ago. And discovering I'm pregnant. She laughed softly. That's just perfect timing. Jeffrey stared at the woman he'd married 7 years ago, brilliant, beautiful, utterly controllable Kim, and realized with creeping horror that he'd never actually known her at all. What do you want? He finally asked. Nothing. Kim walked past him toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. I don't need anything from you, Jeffrey. I have my father's support, my own resources, and 2 children who will carry your name whether you deserve that honor or not. You can proceed with your divorce. Marry Scarlett. Build your perfect strategic partnership. Live the life you were planning. Then why are you telling me this? She looked back at him, silhouetted against the hospital's harsh fluorescent hallway light now, the golden glow from the window behind her making her look almost ethereal. Because I wanted to see your face when you realized what you were walking away from. Wanted to watch you understand that the legacy you've spent your entire life building. She pressed her hand against her stomach. It's right here. And you chose to abandon it for better optics and European capital connections. Jeffrey opened his mouth, closed it, found no words adequate for the moment. Kim, you don't understand what you're doing. Her smile was the saddest thing he'd ever seen. And the most powerful. No, Jeffrey, she said softly. You never understood what I was capable of. Then she walked out, leaving him standing in a hospital room painted in sunset gold and sterile white, surrounded by the ruins of a future he'd constructed without ever checking if the foundation was solid. And for the first time in his carefully controlled life, Jeffrey Westover had absolutely no idea what to do next. The headline appeared first on a financial gossip blog at 6:42 a.m., 3 days after the hospital confrontation. Tech titan's wife hospitalized amid divorce rumors. By noon, it had been picked up by Page 6, Business Insider, and 3 separate tech newsletters with subscriber lists that included every major investor in Jeffrey's company. By 2 p.m., his phone was exploding. Jeffrey sat in his office, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, desk so expensive it had been featured in Architectural Digest, walls lined with awards that proved his genius, and watched his carefully constructed world begin its collapse in real time. It's damage control, Amanda said, pacing in front of his desk like a general surveying a battlefield already lost. We release a statement. The Westovers are separating amicably. Mrs. Westover experienced a minor health incident unrelated to the separation. Both parties request privacy during this transition. They're asking about pregnancy. Jeffrey's voice was hollow. He hadn't slept in 3 days. Couldn't eat. Couldn't think about anything except Kim's face in that hospital room, her hand on her abdomen, her quiet devastation of everything he'd built. Amanda stopped pacing. What? Someone leaked it. Not the details, but enough. Investors are calling. They want to know if there's a pregnancy. If there are complications. Is there? Jeffrey looked at his communications director, brilliant, ruthless, loyal only to the narrative she could control, and realized he couldn't tell her. Couldn't tell anyone. Because the moment he confirmed Kim was carrying twins, every investor would do the same math Marcus Chun had done years ago. Clause 17. 40% equity reversion. Loss of board control. The end of everything. Jeffrey. Amanda's voice had gone sharp. Is your wife pregnant? That's private medical. Nothing is private when you're worth $8 billion and your wife was just hospitalized during divorce proceedings. She leaned on his desk. I need to know what we're managing here. Because if she's pregnant and you filed for divorce, the optics are catastrophic. I know. Jeffrey stood, walked to his window, looked down at the city that had crowned him king. She's 11 weeks. Twins. The silence behind him was profound. Jesus Christ, Jeffrey. I didn't know. That doesn't matter. Amanda's professional calm shattered. You filed for divorce while your wife was pregnant with your children? Do you understand what the board is going to, what your father is going to? My father doesn't know. He will. By tonight, everyone will know. And when they do. Amanda grabbed her tablet, already pulling up files. The Chin investment contracts. There are protective provisions, aren't there? I remember during due diligence, some lawyers mentioning. Clause 17. Jeffrey's voice was barely audible. If I divorce before the 5-year anniversary, 40% of my shares revert to Kim's family. With voting rights. Amanda's face went pale. The anniversary is 4 months away. So if you finalize this divorce, I lose control of my own company. Jeffrey turned from the window. Marcus Chun becomes the largest shareholder. Kim's family controls the board. Everything I built, everything I sacrificed for. His phone buzzed. Then again. Then started ringing continuously, the emergency ringtone he'd programmed for his 5 most critical board members. Amanda glanced at her own phone. Emergency board meeting. Called by Robert Hastings. Jeffrey, he's the chair of. I know who he is. Jeffrey's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his desk, trying to project the control he absolutely didn't feel. They know. How? Marcus Chun probably told them. A bitter laugh escaped. He's been planning this. Probably since I first pitched him 7 years ago. The protective clause wasn't about the investment, it was about his daughter. Another buzz. This one, a text from a number Jeffrey recognized immediately, though he'd never saved it. Emergency call. Tonight. 7 p.m. My office. Do not be late. Father. 300 miles away, in a prenatal clinic that smelled like lavender and played soft instrumental music, Kim Westover was experiencing something Jeffrey's boardroom would never understand. Wonder. Dr. Mitchell had her latest ultrasound on the screen, 2 forms clearer now, more defined, growing from abstract possibilities into actual human beings with measured heartbeats and tiny forming limbs. Baby A is measuring perfectly, Dr. Mitchell said, her voice warm with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for miracles. Strong heartbeat at 165 beats per minute. And baby B. She moved the wand slightly. Also perfect. 162 beats per minute. Kim stared at the screen, tears sliding down her cheeks unchecked. Not the broken tears of 3 days ago. Not the angry tears of 7 years of marriage. But something new, pure, overwhelming love for lives she'd created while their father was planning to discard her. Do you want to know the sex? Dr. Mitchell asked gently. Not yet. Kim's hand found her abdomen again, that unconscious gesture she couldn't seem to stop. I just want to know they're okay. That everything I'm doing won't. Kim. The doctor set down her equipment and met her patient's eyes. Stress is normal. Worry is normal. But these babies? They're strong. They're healthy. And whatever's happening in your life, whatever battles you're fighting, they're safe. You're keeping them safe. Kim nodded, unable to speak past the emotion lodging in her throat. Her phone buzzed silently in her purse. Then again. Messages from numbers she didn't recognize, reporters probably, trying to get comments on headlines she hadn't seen yet. Trying to turn her private devastation into public spectacle. She ignored them all. Because in this moment, in this quiet room with soft music and lavender air and 2 heartbeats echoing through speakers, she wasn't Mrs. Jeffrey Westover, abandoned wife, public scandal, cautionary tale. She was just Kim. And she was going to be a mother. Can I have copies? She asked quietly. Of the ultrasound? Dr. Mitchell smiled. Of course. I'll print several. Kim thought about the brownstone in Brooklyn. About the nursery she could create in the room with morning light. About the future she'd build without Jeffrey, without his empire, without needing anything except the fierce love growing inside her and the iron will her father had taught her to wield. She thought about Clause 17 and 40% equity and board voting rights. But mostly, she thought about two tiny hearts beating independently of the man who'd created them but couldn't control them. Legacy, she told Jeffrey, wasn't about empires. It was about this. The Westover Patriarch's office made Jeffrey's look modest. Richard Westover had built his fortune in manufacturing before tech was fashionable, had multiplied it through strategic investments, and had passed down to his son not just money but the ruthless understanding that legacy mattered more than love. He stood at his window, older than Jeffrey, harder, infinitely more dangerous, and didn't turn when his son entered at precisely 7 p.m. Sit. Jeffrey sat. The silence stretched for 30 seconds. A full 30 seconds where Richard Westover said nothing, did nothing, just stood with his back to his son while Manhattan glittered below like a kingdom they'd built together. Finally, you humiliated this family. Father. You filed for divorce. Richard's voice was arctic. While your wife was pregnant. With twins. Your heirs. The continuation of our bloodline. And you didn't have the basic dignity to tell her yourself. Left papers on a counter like she was hired help you were terminating. I didn't know about the pregnancy. That's worse. Richard spun from the window, and Jeffrey saw the fury in his father's face, the kind of cold rage that had destroyed competitors and dismantled companies. You should have known. Should have ensured. Should have had the basic competence to understand what you were walking away from. The marriage was over. The marriage is what you make it. What you build. What you protect. Richard walked to his desk, opened a file. The Chin Investment Contracts. Clause 17. Did you even read them before signing? Of course I. Then you knew. Knew that divorcing before 5 years would trigger equity reversion. Knew that Marcus Chun had positioned himself to take everything if you proved to be the careless son of a bitch you've just demonstrated yourself to be. Jeffrey's face burned. I can fix this. How? Richard threw the folder across the desk. The board is in chaos. Investors are calling for emergency audits. The Chin family has the leverage to destroy you, and your solution to this was to trade your wife for a venture capitalist's daughter? For better connections. Scarlet brings nothing we don't already have. What you had was a wife from a family that controls pharmaceutical patents worth billions. A wife intelligent enough to see through your bullshit and loyal enough to stay anyway. A wife now carrying your heirs while you're publicly courting her replacement. Richard leaned forward. You had everything, Jeffrey. And you traded it for ego. The words landed like physical blows. I want the divorce. What you want stopped mattering the moment you impregnated your wife and then tried to discard her. Richard's voice dropped to something even more dangerous than anger. Here's what's going to happen. You will call off the divorce. You will apologize to Kimberly Chen Westover. You will do whatever it takes to repair this marriage. Because if you don't... He paused, letting the threat build. I will personally ensure that you lose everything. Not just the company. Not just the fortune. But the name. The legacy. The dynasty I spent 50 years building. I will erase you from the Westover line so completely that your children will grow up knowing their grandfather disowned their father. Jeffrey couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Couldn't process the totality of his destruction. Father, please. Fix it. Richard picked up his phone, dismissing his son like the disappointment he'd proven to be. Or lose everything. Kim moved out of the penthouse on a Tuesday morning while Jeffrey was in emergency damage control meetings with his board. She didn't take much. The designer clothes could stay, they'd been costumes for a role she was no longer playing. The jewelry could remain in velvet boxes, gifts given to accessories, not wives. The art, the furniture, the carefully curated life they'd built together in marble and glass and cold perfection, all of it could stay in the museum of their failed marriage. She took her grandmother's jade bracelet. Her mother's letters. 3 photo albums from before Jeffrey, when she'd been just Kim Chun, brilliant and whole and not yet diminished by loving a man who confused control with partnership. And she took the ultrasound images. Those went into her purse, close to her heart, more valuable than everything else combined. The moving company Marcus sent was discreet, efficient, gone within 2 hours. By noon, Kim's presence had been erased from the penthouse as thoroughly as Jeffrey had tried to erase her from his future. The irony wasn't lost on her. The Chin estate in Westchester was everything the penthouse wasn't: warm, lived in, filled with a kind of generational weight that came from houses that raised families instead of impressing investors. Kim's childhood bedroom had been preserved exactly as she'd left it for college. Bookshelves overflowing with medical journals and classic novels. A window seat where she'd spent countless hours reading. Walls painted the soft blue her mother had chosen before the cancer took her when Kim was 16. She stood in the doorway, suitcase in hand, and felt something crack in her chest. Not breaking, settling. Like bones realigning after being set wrong for years. Your room, or the guest suite? Marcus appeared beside her, silent as always, carrying her other bag. My room. Kim stepped inside, breathed in air that smelled like safety and childhood and the version of herself she'd abandoned to become Mrs. Westover. I want to remember who I was before him. Marcus set down the bag and pulled his daughter into an embrace that said everything his controlled exterior usually didn't. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he rarely showed. You're still her, Kimberly. You just forgot for a while. The routine Kim built over the next week was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Each morning she woke at 6, not because Jeffrey's schedule demanded it, but because the quiet hours before dawn belonged to her now. She walked the estate grounds, hand on her growing abdomen, talking to the twins in whispers about the life they'd have. The freedom they'd know. The love they'd never doubt. She ate breakfast with her father when he wasn't traveling, their conversations ranging from biotech patents to baby names to the strategic dismantling of Jeffrey's attempts at reconciliation. She attended prenatal yoga classes under an assumed name, finding peace in rooms full of women who didn't know she was the subject of Manhattan's most scandalous divorce speculation. She read everything. Parenting books and legal documents and the investment contracts Marcus had structured 7 years ago with the foresight of a man who understood that protecting daughters required preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. And slowly, deliberately, Kim Chin Westover began shedding the second half of her name and reclaiming the first. The media speculation grew from whisper to roar within days. Tech billionaire's wife moves out amid pregnancy rumors. Is Kim Westover carrying Jeffrey's heir? Divorce drama. Westover marriage implodes as company shares tumble. Kim watched the headlines from her father's study, drinking ginger tea that helped with morning sickness, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Jeffrey had spent 7 years controlling their narrative, managing their image, ensuring the world saw only what he wanted them to see. Now the narrative was controlling him. They're camped outside the gates, Marcus said, reviewing security footage of news vans and photographers with long-range lenses. I can have them removed. No. Kim set down her tea. Let them watch. Let them wonder. The more they speculate, the more pressure builds on Jeffrey. Marcus smiled that shark smile. You're learning. I had an excellent teacher. The revelation came during dinner 3 days after Kim moved in. Marcus had been quiet throughout the meal, unusually so, his mind clearly working through something that required his full attention. Finally, as Kim was clearing plates, he spoke. You haven't told me everything. Kim froze, hands on silverware. Dad. The hospital. The prenatal appointments. The way you keep touching your abdomen. Marcus's voice was gentle but inexorable. Kimberly. What aren't you telling me? She turned to face her father, this man who'd protected her always, who'd structured contracts to save her years before she needed saving, who'd taught her that power was patient and precise. Twins, she whispered. I'm carrying twins. The silence that followed was profound. Then Marcus stood, walked to his daughter, and pressed his forehead against hers in a gesture from her childhood. Connection, understanding, unconditional love. My grandbabies, he said, voice breaking on the last word. He was going to walk away from my grandbabies. He didn't know. He didn't care to know. Didn't care to ask. Didn't care about anything except his next strategic move. Marcus pulled back, and Kim saw tears in her father's eyes for the first time since her mother's funeral. But we will protect them. You, me, the entire resources of this family. Those children will want for nothing. Know nothing but love. Understand nothing but their own worth. Kim's own tears fell freely. I'm scared. Good. Fear keeps us careful. But Kimberly. Marcus cupped her face. You are stronger than your fear. Stronger than his betrayal. Stronger than anything he thought he could reduce you to. You are my daughter. You carry my grandchildren. And anyone who tries to hurt you will learn exactly what that costs. Jeffrey's first attempt at contact came via text at 11 p.m. that night. Kim, please. We need to talk. I made a mistake. Kim deleted it without responding. The next morning brought flowers, ridiculous, expensive arrangements that arrived every hour on the hour. Roses, peonies, orchids, each with cards bearing increasingly desperate messages. I'm sorry. Please call me. I need to explain. The babies. We should discuss the babies. Kim had them donated to a women's shelter. Let Jeffrey's apology flowers comfort women leaving situations he'd never understand. By day 3, he appeared at the estate gates in person. The security footage showed him arguing with guards, eventually sitting in his car for 2 hours before finally leaving. Kim watched from her bedroom window, hand on her abdomen, and felt nothing but the cold certainty that the man who'd abandoned her didn't get to demand her attention now that abandonment had consequences. On day 5, Jeffrey sent his lawyer with a new contract, revised settlement terms, offers of co-parenting arrangements, promises of financial support so generous they'd fund a small nation. Kim accepted the papers, thanked the lawyer politely, and burned them in her father's fireplace while Marcus watched with approval. He thinks everything is negotiable, she said, watching Jeffrey's promises curl into ash. Everything is negotiable, Marcus replied. But only if both parties need something from each other. What does Jeffrey have that you need? Kim thought about the penthouse she didn't want, the fortune she didn't need, the name she'd already started shedding. Nothing, she said. Absolutely nothing. The lawyer Marcus recommended was a woman named Victoria Chun, no relation, but the shared surname felt like fate. She'd built her reputation destroying powerful men in divorce court, turning their assets into lessons about underestimating women. They met in Marcus's study, sunlight streaming through windows overlooking grounds where Kim had learned to be strong, be silent, be strategic. Victoria was 50s, elegant, sharp-eyed in a way that suggested she saw through everything. She reviewed Kim's file with the focus of a surgeon examining an X-ray. Clause 17, she said finally. Marcus, you magnificent bastard. You've had this planned since the engagement. Since the pitch meeting, Marcus corrected. I knew what kind of man Jeffrey was the moment he prioritized his presentation over actually listening. Victoria turned to Kim. He's been trying to contact you? Constantly. Good. Let him. Let him make mistakes. Send desperate texts. Show up uninvited. Every attempt proves our case that he's trying to manipulate you back into compliance. Victoria pulled out a legal pad. Here's what we're going to do. We're not negotiating the divorce Jeffrey filed. We're filing our own. With our terms. Our timeline. Our demands. What demands? Kim asked. Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut. Everything he tried to deny you. Full custody of the twins with supervised visitation. Enforcement of Clause 17, 40% equity reversion with board voting rights. Child support calculated not on his current income but on the company's projected earnings. And she paused for effect. A comprehensive NDA that prevents him from discussing you, the children, or the marriage in any public forum without written consent. Kim's breath caught. Can we get that? Kimberly. Victoria leaned forward. Right now, Jeffrey Westover is hemorrhaging investor confidence, board support, and public sympathy. His father is threatening to disown him. His company stock is tumbling. And you hold the leverage that can either save him or destroy him completely. The twins. The twins, Victoria agreed. His heirs. His legacy. The only thing that matters to the Westover dynasty. Jeffrey needs you to cooperate. Needs you to be reasonable. Needs you to be the compliant wife who makes this easy for him. Her expression hardened. We're going to teach him what happens when you build your empire on underestimating women. Kim looked at her father, who nodded once. Looked at Victoria, who waited with the patience of someone who knew they held the winning hand. Looked at the ultrasound image on Marcus's desk. 2 small forms, 2 beating hearts, 2 lives depending on her to be stronger than she'd ever been. When do we start? Kim asked. Victoria smiled. We already have. The leak came from Scarlett's Instagram story at 9:47 a.m. on a Wednesday that would be remembered in Manhattan social circles for years. A photo, her left hand, fourth finger bare but positioned suggestively against a Tiffany blue box. Caption: "Some decisions are worth waiting for." Ring sparkles #new beginnings. She deleted it within minutes. But the internet was forever, and screenshots were already circulating through group chats, gossip blogs, and the phones of every investor who'd put money into Jeffrey's company. By 10 a.m., Page 6 had run it as breaking news. Westover moving on? Mystery woman hints at engagement while divorce still pending. By 11, Jeffrey's PR team was in full crisis mode. By noon, Kim Chin Westover was walking into the offices of Hartman & Associates, Manhattan's most prestigious divorce litigation firm, looking like a woman who'd never known what it meant to break. The conference room was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, a table so polished it reflected like still water, leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars. Jeffrey's legal team had arrived early, claimed the power positions, arranged their documents like battle formations. They'd expected the abandoned wife. Devastated, desperate, willing to accept whatever terms would end her humiliation quickly. They got Kim instead. She wore ivory, not the white of innocence, but the cream of old money and older power. A tailored dress that showed her figure without apology, the subtle curve of her abdomen now visible to anyone who looked closely. Her hair was pulled back simply, no expensive styling necessary. Diamond studs her mother had left her, not Jeffrey's gifts, never his gifts again. Victoria Chun entered beside her, briefcase in hand, expression promising bloodshed conducted with perfect legality. And behind them, taking a seat against the wall like a silent promise of destruction, Marcus Chun. Jeffrey's lead attorney, Thomas Brennan, Harvard Law, never lost a case that mattered, actually faltered when he saw Marcus. Because Marcus Chun didn't attend divorce negotiations. Marcus Chun bought companies, destroyed competitors, and sat on boards that controlled billions. His presence here meant this wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution. Jeffrey arrived 10 minutes late, a power play that would have worked if Kim had been waiting anxiously instead of reviewing documents with the calm of someone who'd already won. He looked terrible. Shadows under his eyes, suit slightly rumpled, the polish that usually armored him worn thin by 2 weeks of watching his world collapse in slow motion. He froze when he saw her. Because Kim, abandoned, pregnant, supposedly devastated Kim, looked like she'd been carved from marble and crowned in certainty. She met his eyes with the expression of someone who'd stopped caring what he thought the moment he'd stopped deserving her concern. "Shall we begin?" Victoria's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Thomas cleared his throat, recovering his composure. "We're here to discuss the dissolution of marriage that Mr. Westover filed." "No." Victoria didn't raise her voice. "Didn't need to. We're here to discuss the counterfiling my client submitted yesterday. I believe you received the documents." Thomas's jaw tightened. Mrs. Westover's alternative proposal is not realistic given. Given what? Kim spoke for the first time, her voice steady as bedrock. Given that your client filed for divorce while I was pregnant? Given that he's already moved on to his next strategic partnership? Given that his fiancée-to-be posted about it on social media this morning? Jeffrey's face went white. "Kim, that wasn't, Scarlett didn't mean." "Scarlett Devereux." Kim said the name like she was reading from a file. Which, judging by the folder Victoria slid across the table, she was. 28 years old. Daughter of Pierre Devereux, venture capitalist. You met her at the New York Tech Summit in March. 7 months ago. The same summit where you told me you were too busy for spouses to attend. She opened the folder. Inside, printed photographs. Jeffrey and Scarlett at restaurants, hotels, entering a Tribeca townhouse. Dates, times, locations. A timeline of betrayal documented with the precision of a prosecution case. Monaco was particularly interesting, Kim continued, her tone conversational, devastating. You posted photos with the Crown Prince, the aerospace CEO. Very professional. But Scarlett was there too, wasn't she? Just out of frame. Always just out of frame. Jeffrey couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Could only watch his carefully constructed denials crumble under evidence he'd thought was hidden. Thomas tried to recover. "Mrs. Westover, while we understand you're hurt, Personal grievances don't affect the settlement terms. You're right. Kim's smile was gentle, lethal. Let's discuss terms. Specifically, Clause 17 of the original Chun Biotech investment contract. The one your client signed 7 years ago without reading carefully enough. She slid another document across the table. Thomas picked it up, started reading, and his expression shifted from confident to horrified in the time it took his eyes to find page 43. If divorce is finalized before the 5-year wedding anniversary, which is in 3 months and 2 weeks, 40% of Mr. Westover's shares revert to my family. With full voting rights. Non-transferable. Kim's voice never wavered. Your client will lose control of his own company. My father becomes the largest shareholder. The board answers to us, not him. That can't be. Thomas was speed reading now, looking for the escape clause that didn't exist. This is unconscionable. It's ironclad, Victoria said calmly. Reviewed by 3 separate firms. Legal in all jurisdictions. Enforceable immediately upon divorce finalization. Jeffrey's hands were shaking. Actually shaking. Kim, please. I'm not finished. Kim's hand moved to her abdomen, that unconscious gesture that had become her signature. There's one more thing your client should know. One more variable he didn't account for in his carefully planned exit strategy. She pulled out the ultrasound image. Set it on the table between them like evidence in a trial that would define the rest of their lives. I'm carrying twins. Your children, Jeffrey. Your heirs. The legacy you claim to value so much. Her voice dropped to something softer, more dangerous. The legacy you were willing to abandon for better optics and European connections. The silence in the room was absolute. Thomas looked at Jeffrey. Jeffrey looked at Kim. Marcus looked at everyone with the expression of a man watching dominoes fall exactly as he'd arranged them. My client demands the following, Victoria said, pulling out her own document. Full physical and legal custody of both children. Mr. Westover will have supervised visitation rights, scheduled to be determined by Mrs. Westover's discretion. Child support calculated on projected company earnings, not current salary. Mandatory inheritance rights for both children, non-negotiable, irrevocable trust funds established immediately. She paused, letting each demand land like a hammer blow. Additionally, Mr. Westover will make no public statements regarding the marriage, the divorce, or the children without written approval from Mrs. Westover's legal team. No denial of paternity. No custody challenges. No attempts to use his children as leverage in business negotiations. That's, Thomas started. Non-negotiable, Victoria finished. Your client has 2 options. Accept these terms and finalize the divorce on Mrs. Westover's timeline, maintaining some relationship with his children and avoiding the Clause 17 disaster. Or proceed with his original filing, lose 40% of his company, face a protracted custody battle he cannot win, and watch his children grow up knowing their father chose his empire over them. Kim leaned forward. I don't want your company, Jeffrey. I don't want your fortune. I don't even want revenge. Her voice cracked slightly, the first sign of the pain beneath her armor. I want my children to be safe. To grow up knowing they were wanted. To never doubt their worth the way you made me doubt mine. Jeffrey's face was wet. Actually wet with tears he couldn't control anymore. I want full custody because I will never trust you to prioritize them over your next strategic move. I want inheritance rights because they deserve security you clearly can't provide. I want control over public statements because I will not let you turn our children into PR tools. Kim's hand pressed harder against her stomach. And I want you to sign these papers and walk away so I can build them a life that doesn't include waiting for a father who's always 3 meetings away from caring. Kim, his voice broke completely. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know, I didn't think. No, you didn't. Kim stood, suddenly exhausted, suddenly ready for this to end. Sign the papers, Jeffrey. Give me my freedom. Give our children their peace. And maybe someday they'll want to know you. But that's their choice. Not yours. Not anymore. Victoria slid the final document across the table. Terms that would cost Jeffrey billions, pride, control, everything except the bloodline he'd almost thrown away. Thomas was whispering frantically in Jeffrey's ear. Probably about appeals, challenges, alternative strategies. But Jeffrey wasn't listening. He was looking at Kim, really looking at her for maybe the first time in years. Seeing the woman he'd married, the wife he'd discarded, the mother of his children who just reminded him exactly what power looked like when wielded with purpose instead of ego. He picked up the pen. His hand shook so badly he could barely write. But he signed. Every page. Every clause. Every surrender. And when he finished, Kim took the documents without a word, turned, and walked out of the conference room where she just reclaimed her entire future. Behind her, Jeffrey Westover sat in his expensive chair in his power position seat and understood, finally, completely devastatingly, what it meant to lose everything by trying to discard the one thing that mattered. 6 months after the signing, Kim stood in front of her bathroom mirror in the Brooklyn brownstone and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked broken, but because she looked whole. Her belly was round now, unmistakably pregnant, the twins making their presence known with kicks and rolls that felt like conversations she was learning to understand. She'd stopped hiding it weeks ago, stopped wearing loose clothing and strategic angles. Why hide a miracle? Why diminish power? She wore a deep emerald dress tonight, fitted, elegant, unapologetic about the life growing inside her. Her hair fell in soft waves over bare shoulders. No expensive jewelry. No armor borrowed from someone else's fortune. Just Kim. Just herself. Just enough. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks ago, embossed and elegant. The Manhattan Women's Foundation cordially invites you to the annual philanthropy gala honoring this year's outstanding women in business and social impact. Her name was on it. Not as Jeffrey's wife. Not as +1 or accessory or the woman standing beside power. Kimberly Chun, honoree. For her work with maternal health care initiatives. For the foundation she'd quietly built over the past 6 months, funding prenatal care for women who couldn't afford the doctors who'd saved her. For being exactly who she'd always been, just finally visible without someone else's shadow obscuring her light. Marcus appeared in the doorway, immaculate in his tuxedo, pride written across his face in a language only fathers and daughters understood. "You look like your mother," he said softly. Kim's eyes filled. "I wish she could see them." "She does." Marcus placed his hand over Kim's, over the twins who kicked in response like they recognized their grandfather's voice. "And she's so proud. Of who you've become. Of how you survived. Of the mother you're going to be." "I'm terrified," Kim whispered. "Good. Fear keeps us careful. But Kimberly." Marcus met her eyes in the mirror. "You are going to be extraordinary. Just like you've always been." The Plaza Ballroom was exactly as Kim remembered. Crystal chandeliers dripping light like liquid diamonds, tables set with precision that suggested art rather than dining. 500 of Manhattan's most powerful people gathered to celebrate women who'd built empires while men weren't looking. Kim arrived with her father, and the room didn't just notice. It stopped. Because the woman walking in, radiant, pregnant, utterly unshakable, wasn't the devastated wife from scandal headlines 6 months ago. Wasn't the abandoned woman the media had pitted and dissected and reduced to tabloid tragedy. This was Kimberly Chun. And she looked like she'd been crowned by forces more powerful than any man's fortune could buy. Cameras flashed. Whispers rippled. Kim smiled and kept walking, hand on her father's arm, head high, the twins moving inside her like they approved of every step. She was seated at a table with other honorees, women who'd built companies, funded research, changed legislation, created spaces where other women could thrive. They welcomed her not as Jeffrey Westover's ex-wife, but as one of them. A warrior. A survivor. A woman who'd taken her breaking and transformed it into building. During dinner, Kim felt it. That prickling awareness that said someone was watching. She turned, scanning the room, and found him. Jeffrey stood near the back, partially hidden by a pillar, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than the venue. He looked older than 6 months should have made him. Thinner. Harder around the edges where confidence used to make him seem invincible. He was staring at her with an expression Kim couldn't quite name. Not anger. Not regret exactly. Something closer to recognition, the look of a man finally seeing what he'd been too blind to notice before. Their eyes met across the ballroom, across the ruins of what they'd been, across the future he'd tried to steal and she'd reclaimed anyway. Kim didn't look away. Didn't flinch. Didn't give him the satisfaction of reaction. She just placed her hand on her belly, his children, her power, their legacy, and smiled. Then she turned back to her table, to her conversation, to her life that no longer included him except in the biology of 2 lives he contributed to but would never control. Jeffrey stayed for exactly 7 more minutes. Then disappeared into the Manhattan night like a ghost haunting his own mistakes. The speech came after dessert, after awards were distributed to women who'd changed their corners of the world through sheer refusal to accept limitations men had set for them. Kim stood at the podium, one hand resting on her belly, the other gripping the microphone with the steadiness of someone who'd learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was the courage to be seen. 6 months ago, she began, her voice carrying through the ballroom with the clarity of truth spoken without apology. I thought my life was ending. I'd just learned my marriage was over. That the man I'd spent 7 years building a life with had decided I was no longer useful to his ambitions. The room was utterly silent. That same night, I learned I was pregnant. With twins. And I realized something that changed everything. Kim's hand pressed harder against her abdomen. Legacy isn't what we build for others to admire. It's what we leave in the hearts of those we love. In the lives we create. In the strength we teach our children by surviving what should have destroyed us. She paused, gathering herself, gathering the words that had been forming since that night in the hospital when everything shattered and reformed simultaneously. I'm being honored tonight for maternal health care initiatives. For funding clinics and research and support systems for women who find themselves alone and pregnant and terrified. But the truth is, I built those programs for myself. For the woman I was 6 months ago, sitting in a hospital room, wondering how I would survive becoming a mother while my marriage was dying. Tears tracked down her face now, unchecked, unashamed. I survived because of women like the ones in this room. Because my father taught me that power isn't loud, it's necessary. Because doctors and lawyers and friends showed me that family isn't just who we're born to, it's who shows up when we're breaking. Kim looked directly at the camera recording the event, knowing Jeffrey might watch this someday, knowing her children certainly would. To every woman who's been told she's too much or not enough or only valuable when she's useful to someone else's ambitions, you are the legacy. You are the empire. You are everything they tried to convince you that you weren't. The standing ovation started before she finished the last word, thunderous and fierce and full of recognition from 500 women who'd fought their own battles and won their own wars. Kim stood at that podium, hand on her belly where 2 lives kicked in response to their mother's voice, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not just survival. Not just strength. Joy. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning when spring was painting Brooklyn in shades of new beginning, Kim's water broke. No panic. No fear. Just Marcus driving calmly while Kim breathed through contractions, counting seconds between them, talking to the twins in whispers that promised safety and love and a world where they would never doubt their worth. The delivery room was filled with people who'd chosen to be there. Marcus holding her hand, Dr. Mitchell coaching her breathing, nurses who'd cared for her through months of appointments and now witnessed the culmination of everything that journey meant. No husband. No betrayer. No one who'd earned their place through biology but lost it through choice. Just love. Just presence. Just the people who'd proven family was about showing up, not showing off. The first cry came at 6:47 a.m., sharp, furious, absolutely perfect. It's a girl, Dr. Mitchell announced, placing a tiny screaming miracle on Kim's chest. Kim sobbed, pressing her face against her daughter's dark hair, breathing in that newborn smell that was somehow both foreign and the most familiar thing she'd ever known. She's perfect, Marcus whispered, tears streaming down his face as he touched his granddaughter's impossibly small hand. 8 minutes later, the second cry joined the first. And here's your son, Dr. Mitchell said, laying him beside his sister. 2 babies. 2 lives. 2 perfect, screaming, absolutely beautiful reasons for everything Kim had survived. She looked at her father, who was openly weeping now, all control abandoned in the face of joy too enormous to contain. What will you name them? He asked. Kim looked at her children, her daughter with Marcus's eyes, her son with her mother's chin, and felt the last piece of Jeffrey Westover fall away like a name she'd been wearing but never truly owned. Grace, she said, touching her daughter's cheek. For the strength I found when I thought I had none left. And James, she pressed her lips to her son's forehead, after your grandfather's middle name. Because he taught me what real power looks like. Grace and James Chun. Not Westover. Never Westover. They would carry their mother's name, their grandfather's legacy, and the knowledge that they were born from love that survived betrayal and became something even stronger. The photograph appeared in the Times 3 days later. Not in the society pages where Kim had once appeared as Jeffrey's beautiful accessory, but in the business section, accompanying an article about the Chin Foundation's expansion and maternal health care initiatives that would serve thousands of women annually. Kim stood in the Brooklyn Brownstones nursery, simple, warm, filled with morning light and the kind of love that didn't need marble and glass to prove its worth. Grace slept in her arms. James in Marcus's. 3 generations of Chin power, quiet and absolute and utterly unshakable. The caption read, Kimberly Chun with her father Marcus Chen and newborn twins Grace and James, as the Chen Foundation announces $50 million expansion of maternal health programs. No mention of Jeffrey. No reference to the divorce. No acknowledgement of scandal or betrayal or the empire she'd supposedly lost. Because Kim hadn't lost anything that mattered. She'd shed what didn't serve her and kept what made her whole. Across the city, in a penthouse that still felt empty despite Scarlett's attempts to redecorate it, Jeffrey read that article 7 times. Looked at that photo of Kim, transformed, transcendent, holding the children he'd contributed DNA to but would only know through supervised visits and carefully negotiated video calls. He'd tried to discard her like an outdated asset. Tried to upgrade to someone younger, better connected, more strategically valuable. Instead, he'd created his greatest rival. His children's hero. The woman whose quiet power would shape his legacy far more than any empire he built. He thought he'd been discarding his wife. He'd actually been crowning his queen. And Kim Chun, no longer Westover, never Westover again, wore that crown like she'd been born to it. Because she had been. She just forgot for 7 years while loving a man too blind to see what he held. But she remembered now. And she would make sure her daughter and son never forgot. True power isn't given by men who think they control the world. It's claimed by women who refuse to let anyone else define their worth. Kim stood in her nursery, children sleeping peacefully, father beside her, future bright with possibility Jeffrey had tried to steal and she'd reclaimed anyway. And she smiled. Not the practiced smile of a billionaire's wife, but the fierce, joyful, unbreakable smile of a woman who'd survived her ending and built from its ashes the most magnificent beginning. He thought he discarded her. But in letting her go, he crowned her. And Kim Chun was just getting started.
And that, my beautiful family, is how a woman who was discarded discovered she was irreplaceable. Jeffrey built an empire on ambition, strategy, and the belief that people were assets to be upgraded. But it took losing Kim to teach him what no boardroom ever could. Legacy isn't built through power. It's born through the people powerful men underestimate. She was betrayed and chose strength. She was abandoned and chose grace. She was broken and chose to rebuild herself into something no man could ever diminish again. So if you've ever been told you weren't enough, weren't valuable, weren't worth keeping, remember Kim. Remember that your worth was never determined by someone else's blindness. You were always the empire. You were always the legacy. You were always enough. If this story reminded you of your own strength, click subscribe, type, I am enough in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from. Because every woman who rises after being knocked down deserves to know. She didn't just survive, she conquered. Until next time, this is Mr. Crown Stories reminding you, you are powerful, you are worthy, and you were never the one who needed fixing.